Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Well, what happened about a week ago is Israel started an operation called Rising Lion. And what they've done in the past week is use military force to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. And as they describe it, eliminate the nuclear threat from Iran, as well as degrade and work to eliminate Iran's missile defense or missile program, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, military industrial complex. And as part of that operation, the Israelis have also targeted the upper echelons of Iran's security leadership, IRGC leadership, which is the IRGC is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. So they're the element of the Iranian security apparatus that has cultivated the network of militias and terrorist organizations across the Middle East that have continued to destabilize many countries across the Middle East. And Israel has also targeted the upper tier of Iran's nuclear scientists, so the people who are actually working to position Iran to develop that nuclear weapon. And how we got there is that over the course of this year, for the first part of the second Trump administration, there has been an emphasis and work by the Trump team to negotiate an agreement to deal with Iran's nuclear program. And right before the upcoming round of talks that were supposed to take place in Oman, Israel decided to launch operations which stopped negotiations from moving forward. And now the world is focused on whether or not there's a possibility of returning to the negotiating table. So the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran Nuclear Agreement for short, is an President Obama-era deal that went into effect in 2015. And the idea of that agreement is to put serious constraints around Iran's nuclear program, flood Iran with inspectors who could verify that the Iranians were not moving for a nuclear weapon capability. And in the theory of that agreement, the Iranians received some sanctions relief related to nuclear sanctions in exchange for moving the window back to 1 year of what we called at the time breakout capacity. So 1 year before the Iranians could move and to cross that nuclear threshold for a nuclear weapon device. When Trump came into office the first time, there were real criticisms of that agreement. The criticisms fall into a few buckets. One is that it was a time-limited agreement. So there were only 10 years that agreement was into effect. And presumably on the other side, critics of the agreement would say that the Iranians could have then decided to pursue a nuclear weapon. Number two is that agreement, the JCPOA, did not require Iran to dismantle any of its nuclear weapons infrastructure. So essentially, they were able to mothball their nuclear facilities. And finally, the Iran nuclear agreement allowed Iran to maintain domestic enrichment capacity. And so the critics of the agreement would say that because Iran did not have to dismantle their nuclear infrastructure, because they were able to maintain under this agreement low-level uranium enrichment, that provided them the option of reverting back to a nuclear weapon program if the political decision was made at some point. So Trump, when he came into office, looked at all of those indicators and said, this is a terrible deal. I'm ripping it up. I can negotiate a better deal. And to do that, I'm going to impose what he called and his team called a maximum pressure campaign. So full economic sanctions meant to increase and ratchet up pressure so significantly on Iran's economy that the regime would feel coerced to return to the negotiating table and negotiate for a much more significant in terms of constraints on their nuclear program. I think a deal has always been possible. The question is whether or not that deal would have been acceptable for us, and by us I mean the United States first, and secondly for the Middle East and for Israel. And by all accounts, the reports of the negotiations that were being pursued by Steve Witkoff, the President Trump's envoy and personal friend, are that it would have conceded domestic enrichment for some period of time. And so I think for Israel and a lot of people here, especially in Washington, D.C., who were looking at the trajectory of those negotiations, it didn't look like a sufficient deal from a non-proliferation standard. And you could see that there was momentum here in Washington. So, for example, most members of the Republican Senate caucus, so 52 Republican members of the Senate, signed a letter to President Trump insisting that there be absolutely no domestic enrichment allowed under any new diplomatic arrangement with Iran. And there was nothing indicating in those negotiations that the Iranians were willing to concede on that point. So I think there could have been a deal in which there could have been inspectors and constraints and perhaps new sunsets, but whether or not it would have been acceptable and really dealt in a meaningful way with Iran's ability to pursue a nuclear weapon at some point in the future remains very much in question. Well, first of all, on the domestic enrichment situation, I agree with you that it's a major concern. What we're actually seeing happen broadly across the Middle East is many countries are looking at the fact that they have focused their economic growth on oil and natural gas. They're looking at the energy climate when peak oil comes and what more sustainable, renewable forms of energy are. And there are other countries in the Middle East who are thinking about greener energy and have thought about peaceful civilian nuclear programs. So the best example would be the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, who wanted a domestic nuclear peaceful program for nuclear energy purposes. They signed a very specific agreement with the United States to certify that there would not be domestic enrichment, that there were certain protocols that would be adhered to for a very safe, peaceful nuclear energy program. And that's really the pathway that would be in the U.S. interest from a security perspective. And you're right that nothing about the Iranian program would suggest that it was exclusively peaceful. And in fact, only a few days before the Israelis started their military campaign, there was this really significant meeting at the IAEA, a Board of Governors meeting in Vienna, where the Director General of the IAEA says publicly, and they released his comments, so it's out there for the whole world to see, there is absolutely no peaceful explanation for this level of nuclear enrichment and this program. If you actually have a peaceful program for domestic energy purposes, it doesn't look like what the Iranians were doing. And so Rafael Grossi, has been very, very clear on that point. And you heard Trump administration officials in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the initiation of the Israeli military campaign exactly the point you're making, George, which is that this is what a peaceful energy program looks like. You actually don't need domestic enrichment if you're just talking about nuclear energy for your own people. And we're willing to work with the Iranians to actually have that kind of program. And I think the bluff on the Iranian side was called because they're just not willing or have not yet been willing to concede on domestic enrichment. And on the question about the negotiations under the previous administration, this is an interesting moment we're in right now where the American people and government are contemplating using our own military to address Iran's nuclear program. But before the past week, the issue of Iran's nuclear ambitions and the possibility that the Iranians would seek to acquire a nuclear weapon capability has been one of the highest priorities of the past 5 presidential administrations, both Democrat and Republican. Every president comes into office, looks at this problem set, and says, no nuclear weapon, can't happen on my watch. Military options are on the table, but I really prefer a diplomatic arrangement, and so I'm going to prioritize talks and try to do it that way. So you saw an agreement that put constraints on, but did not eliminate completely the risk of a nuclear weapon capability under the Obama administration. We had the Trump administration pull out, and after the Trump withdrawal, the Iranians took step after step after step that took them so much closer to that threshold where they could choose to break out. So in the Biden team, I think they looked at this problem set and said, this is really serious. We're also committed to the Iranians not getting a nuclear weapon. and we're going to test the waters of diplomacy first. And as you know, the rest is history. There were multiple attempts. There was, of course, a lot of changes in Iran. There were changes here. And at some point in the Biden administration, because we were so close to those restrictions on Iran's program ending anyway, as I said earlier, because they only lasted a decade, the Biden team looked at this problem and said, getting back into the 2015 nuclear arrangement doesn't really make sense for us, given how far the Iranian program has advanced. So we're going to pause on actually negotiating to re-enter the JCPOA. We're open to something else, but it has to be longer and stronger. And by the way, the Iranians have all of these other really challenging, destabilizing activities that they're doing. Maybe something might have happened, but then, of course, we got to October 7th. Hamas commits this terrible act of violence and terrorism against the Israeli people, and all of the priorities about what the United States was doing in the Middle East changed.